All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and want to honor everyone's time for being here. And I'd like to open up by saying, first of all, thank you to everyone for attending this, what for me is a amazing webinar. It's going to be an amazing webinar. My name is Paul Nargisian, and on behalf of the International Big History Association, I'd like to welcome you all to Dr. Steven Thiru's talk today on his most recent book, A Most Probable Story, The Evolution of the Universe, Life, and Humankind. I had the honor to review the book a few months ago, and I must say that being a fellow biologist, I'm very happy to see a book that falls under the umbrella of big history, written by a fellow biologist. So I'm very curious to hear more about Steven's thoughts and ideas and how he approached this content from a biologist perspective. I think that was one of the voices that has been in the minority when it comes to big history. We've had many scientists, don't get me wrong, phenomenal historians who have written on this concept of big history, but to look at it from the lens of a biologist is really interesting and I think very timely. So I want to introduce you to our speaker today. His name is Dr. Steven Thiru, and he currently serves as professor of biology at Assumption University in Worcester, Massachusetts. He served as a chair of the Natural Science Department between 2006 and 2009. He also serves as an instructor at Harvard University since the summer of 1998. He's taught numerous courses in concepts of biology, molecular and cell biology, biotechnology, principles of genetics and biology of cancer. He has also served as a research associate for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute program in molecular medicine, and as a postdoctoral associate in the Worcester Foundation for Biomedical Research. His education includes a PhD in molecular and cell biology, which he received in 1989 at the University of Manchester at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He has two bachelor's degrees, one in chemistry and one in biology. And of course, I kind of saw those threads. I always get asked by students who are majoring in biology, why do we need so much chemistry? And of course, for all those chemists out there, we know that chemistry is serving as the foundation for biology. So making those links, I think, between chemistry and physics and astronomy and biology is one of the amazing aspects of not only big history, but specifically of this book. I mean, that's kind of the thread that I saw too running throughout each of the chapters. So phenomenal. He has numerous honors and accolades. And if I read the list, it's going to take pretty much the entire time of the webinar. So I'll just kind of go through one or two of them. He received the Assumption College President's Award for Excellence in Service in 2013. And the Outstanding Mentoring of Students by Junior Faculty at Assumption College in 1998. Steven has numerous publications in peer-reviewed scientific journals, from the Journal of Biological Chemistry to Oncogene to Molecular Biology of the Cell, Brain Research Bulletin, and Cellular Signaling. And I hope that he will contribute to the Journal of Big History sometime in the near future as well. So Steven's going to give about a 50-minute presentation, and I understand that he has PowerPoint slides that he's prepared. But prior to doing so, I thought maybe I can ask Steve, if that's okay, just a couple of questions. One of which is, and I'm very interested in this, can you tell us more about your origin story and how you got interested in big history and sort of writing a book about the grand narrative, if you will, of the evolution of the universe and life on Earth.
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for that very nice introduction. I appreciate it, and thank you for inviting me to speak. That actually was what I was going to talk about in one of my first slides here in the preface of why write this book. So I think I'll talk a little bit about that. I wrote it because my friends and I, my colleagues at work, we would often talk about this topic. You know, why are we here? How come we exist? And some of them are here today. And we would, as they know, talk about it in a rather disoriented way. We'd bounce around from topic to topic. And I thought that it's something I've been interested in for a very long time. And I thought that this would be an excuse, writing a book would be an excuse to essentially try to look at the answer to that question in a more rigorous, directional way. And so I set out to do that. And the other reason I did it is because I wanted to learn more about the biology underlying big history. As you've mentioned, there are really some very excellent books about big history from people like David Christensen, Robert Hazen, Walter Alvarez, and many others. But those texts focus primarily, or in some cases entirely, on the physical science or the history of big history. And I really wanted to look at the biological aspects of the subject. And I think that it's important to do that because by looking at the biology that underlies big history, we can get some insight into how all life forms are in fact connected. And we also will gain some understanding about the importance of our environment to biological life forms like us. And in addition, I also think that by studying this topic, we gain insight into how we are connected as humans. And it's just amazing to me to find out just how similar we all are and just how much we all have in common. So I think looking at those sorts of concepts is useful. I think it's useful for us as individuals to have an understanding of these ideas, to have an understanding of how we're connected to other life forms, how important the environment is to us, how dependent we are on it. And I think it's also helpful to understand, as I said, how closely related we are. I think it's important as an individual to know this, but I also think that it's important for societies that want to function well to get an understanding of these things. So I think it's very much worth doing this sort of analysis, looking at big history from a biological perspective. And there really hasn't been a lot of that I'm aware of. I looked around, but as you said, there's not a lot of books about the big history underlying the biology of big history, essentially. And so that's why I set out to do it.
And Steven, when you were you know, initially thinking about writing this book, who were you considering as like the primary readers, or who were you writing to? Was it you know, from an education pedagogical perspective? Was it for even towards scientists who may be so in tune with their specific aspect of research that at times this reductionistic thinking of science sort of gets lost in between the weeds and they don't see essentially the larger picture? Because I find that as being a challenging aspect of teaching biology at the undergraduate level, especially in which we get so drawn into these specific, you know, for example, student learning outcomes, that students don't see the connections between specific, you know, emergent properties, or, you know, the ingredients that led to those emergent properties or complexities. So who was the audience that you were aiming for?
I wrote it for the educated layman, you know, somebody who has perhaps at least some science background. It really, I don't think you need to have a doctorate in biology to follow what I'm writing about. But, you know, again, the idea was the educated layperson hopefully would be able to read the book and get something out of it. And, you know, and I agree with you. I mean, when I worked at some of the places you mentioned earlier, I would bring up topics where I'm working now. There's a lot of people who are very interested in this, and they span disciplines. But at some of the places where I've worked, where it's been much more intense research oriented, when I would bring up topics like this, they would usually say, you know, that's a waste of time to think about that. Let's get back to finding out what this protein is doing. And, you know, And I disagree. You know, I don't think that that's true, and for the reasons you already mentioned. And so, yeah, I mean, I think people who are in that area could benefit from looking at it at the bigger picture. I'm not sure how many will, because they're very busy looking at some small aspect of the picture. But in any case, I think it's at least possible that some people who are doing that might get some benefit from it.
Great. And just one more before I hand it over to you fully. How about the title? Tell me about the title a little bit. Why this title? Why a most improbable story?
Yeah, I mean, because when you look at what it took for us to come into existence, it is really unlikely that we exist. I mean, it's highly improbable that humans would be here. And in the book, I look at that theme throughout the text. You know, what had to happen for us to come into existence? And it's remarkable how many things had to go right for us to come into existence. And so it's really quite highly improbable that we exist, at least if you look at it from a statistician's perspective. But we do, and I think the reasons we do are what I try to look at as I went through the text.
And Steven, many of the subheadings within the chapters, for example, have almost like a religious tone at times, or you're sort of asking the question from not a religious perspective, of course. I mean, everything that you have here is based on the scientific story of life, if you will. But was there any? I'm sure there was, but what was your rationale in sort of doing it that way, in introducing the reader to concepts by almost even putting in a sort of philosophical or religious tone at times?
Yeah, that was actually the next topic I was going to pursue in my talk, because you're right. I mean, I think people approach this topic from different perspectives. You know, there are people who approach it from the perspective of an atheist or an agnostic or a theist, and how you approach it can very much determine how you see the overall information. And so I wanted it to be something that was available to everyone. I mean, I didn't intend to write this for just an atheistic or agnostic scientific population. I hope that this has some appeal to people who are theists, as well as those perhaps who are not.
Great. Well, now that we've teased the audience a bit, and I hopefully interested them in well, they are interested because they're here. I'm going to hand the Zoom floor off to you, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Paul. So I've already covered some of what I was intending to talk about through Paul's questions, which I appreciate him taking the time to prepare. I wanted to get into the introduction. So I already mentioned why I wrote it, the book, but the introduction material, again, it gets to the question of perspective. You know, people who have different perspectives come at this topic in different ways. Ultimately, to understand, though, the biology of big history, I think it's first necessary to review some of the physical science that makes the biology possible. And how we came to be, we think that process initiated in an event called the Big Bang. But there are a lot of questions related to the Big Bang that I think are really interesting, such as why was there a Big Bang? And what came before the Big Bang? And how did the Big Bang generate the laws of physics, the constants of the universe, and the initial conditions that guided the formation of life? Unfortunately, we don't know the answers, but there are many hypotheses. And these hypotheses tend to be influenced heavily by whether the individual putting the hypothesis forward is an atheist or an agnostic or a theist. And in the introduction, I look at some of what I perceive anyway as being the strengths and weaknesses of these different approaches. Because I think there are strengths and weaknesses to each of them. The approach that might be taken by an atheist or an agnostic, as well as the approach that might be taken by a theist. But at the end of the chapter, I make the argument that regardless of your perspective, I think there's something in this for everybody. One of the reasons I think that is for what I said earlier, that this helps us understand who we are and our connection to others in the environment which we live in. But in addition to that, the story itself is a truly fantastic one. It's remarkable. It's really incredible. It's almost like a fictional story, but it's not, right? It's actually based on fact. And so I think there's something in it for everybody, regardless of your perspective. And I would argue that if you are a theist, there's a little bit of an extra bonus, because if you are a theist, understanding the story may give you insight into the nature of the deity that you believe created us, right? So I think there's something in it for everybody. I tried to write the book in that way. My goal was not to alienate any particular group or to really privilege any particular group either. I wanted to approach it from the perspective of someone who, who believes that it's a big tent question, if you will. All right, so once I finished this introduction, I moved on to the part one. And in part one, what I look at is the Big Bang and the first 5 minutes after it. And there's an awful lot going on at that point in time. At that moment, we think dark energy, dark matter, ordinary matter, all of those things were created. We also believe that the four fundamental forces of the universe, electromagnetic force, the gravity, and strong and weak nuclear forces, all were established, as were the fundamental constants of the universe. And I think it's really interesting to speculate how things would be different if, for example, the fundamental forces that guide the universe, or the constants that were established at the beginning of the universe, had been even slightly different. And if they had, in fact, it's quite likely we wouldn't exist. In addition to all of this, though, in that first chapter, I look a little bit at how the distribution and density of matter had a lot to do with the nature of the universe that we currently inhabit. And I look at how the directionality of time might have been established at this moment. So we perceive time as moving unidirectionally. You might wonder why that is. Could you in fact move bidirectionally in time? Well, questions of that kind are the ones I bring up in this chapter. I also look at the three-dimensional nature of the universe, because obviously we exist in a world with 3 dimensions, but it didn't have to be so. Right? The universe could have had 2 dimensions. And if it did, it would be a very different place. So the question that I try to raise in this part of the book is what happened during this first 5 minutes, and how did what happened influence who we are? At the end of the chapter, I look a little bit about the process by which hydrogen and helium nuclei came to be. These nuclei are essentially sometimes referred to as the primordial nuclei, because they are what is used to essentially form all the other building blocks, all the other elements that exist. And so how did the universe construct these hydrogen and helium nuclei? That's how I finish the chapter up, by looking at that question. But I make the argument, and I think it's one that can easily be supported, that the first 5 minutes of the universe existence was perhaps the most important 5 minutes that ever went by. Those first 5 minutes influence all that we were, all that we are, and all that we will ever be. So it's an incredible period. And I think it's worth thinking a little bit about what happened then and how what happened then influenced what happens now. So here is a picture of an artist's rendition of the Big Bang, and is another image of the Big Bang occurring at the beginning of time, which we think this all happened about 13.8 billion years ago. Now, once the first nuclei, that first hydrogen and helium nuclei came into existence, it was eventually possible to form the atoms, the hydrogen and helium atoms. That happened about 380,000 years after the Big Bang. It took some time before that could take place. But once there were hydrogen and helium atoms, it became possible to form stars. And stars are critically important to the structure and composition of our universe. And there's an incredible number of these things. It's mind-boggling, but there are 200 billion trillion stars. That's the estimate. That's not a number that we humans can really wrap our head around. I mean, I don't have any idea what 200 billion trillion or something might look like. But in any case, that's what we think, that there are these incredibly large numbers of these stars. And they're important for the reasons I already mentioned. They construct the elements within the universe, most of them anyway. Most of the elements that we interact with and that we need, most of the elements that are needed to form planets and living systems are produced in stars. And they also liberate energy in a way that would allow for the long-term evolutionary development of living creatures. So in this chapter, I look briefly at an outline of the process by which stars are created. And this is an image of a place where stars are born. It's essentially a stellar nursery, if you will. And then I discuss, as I already said, how these stars, by carrying out their various processes, produce elements. And within the big stars, at least, elements from carbon all the way up to iron can be produced through their essentially alchemy, which is an amazing process. I also look a little bit about the fact that in order for stars to produce some of these elements in massive amounts, for example, carbon, carbon is produced in the massive amounts it is because carbon has a high energy resonance state that allows it to be formed in large amounts within stars. And that, it wasn't obvious initially that carbon could be formed in this way. And many people wondered, how is it that there's so much carbon in the universe? But it just so happens that because of the conditions that were laid out essentially at the moment of the Big Bang, carbon can have, under certain conditions, a high energy resonance state that allows it to form in large amounts within stars. So again, that's just one more example of a situation that didn't have to be, right? And if the universe didn't have large amounts of carbon, the universe would be a very different place, and you could question whether carbon-based organisms like us would exist at all. So most of the elements that are produced in stars, as I said, some of them are produced as the star goes about carrying out its various processes, and some of them are produced when the large stars, at least, die. Because when the largest of stars, in fact, die, when some of them blow up as supernovas, and some of them can form neutron stars. And when these neutron stars collide, they too can generate a number of heavy elements. So elements larger than iron, all the way up to uranium, produced in these sorts of events, when stars go supernova or when neutron stars collide. So I talk in this chapter about that process briefly. This isn't a physics book, so it doesn't go into a lot of detail, but I wanted to outline how stars go about generating elements which living organisms obviously need. From there, I move on to a discussion of how stars can form galaxies. We know that there are a lot of galaxies in our universe. And this is a picture from the Webb telescope. It was published recently, and this was from the New York Times about a month ago. And in this image, you see lots of different galaxies. I think this is just a phenomenal image. It's hard to imagine that we could actually generate an image like this, because what we're seeing is an incredible, vast amount of space. Each of these little dots represents a galaxy, and some of these galaxies will have hundreds of billions of stars. Our own galaxy, the Milky Way, has about 200 billion, and it takes 100,000 light years to travel across it. So what you're looking at here is an immense expanse of space, and within it you can see quite a few galaxies, but this is just a very tiny portion of the number of galaxies we think exist, because it's been estimated that there are 2 trillion galaxies in the universe. And so these galaxies, while numerous, many of them appear not to be able to support life. And in fact, it's been estimated that about 90% of galaxies that exist cannot support life. Now, obviously, we live in the Milky Way, which is able to support life. And so one question that you might wonder is what characteristics are necessary for a galaxy to be able to support living systems. And to do that, a galaxy has to have a mixture of short-lived large stars. Those are the stars that are going to produce the heavy elements when they go supernova. And it also has to have some long-living smaller stars. These smaller stars are going to provide the energy that would drive the evolutionary processes that may take billions of years to go through. A galaxy that's able to support life has to also be able to retain the remnants of supernovae explosions. Because when stars do go supernova, if the material they produce leaves the galaxy, then it obviously can't be concentrated. And without heavy elements, life forms like us wouldn't exist. Galaxies that are capable of supporting life also have to have a central massive black hole that is active, but not too active. So we think that most galaxies, if not all galaxies, have a central massive black hole. But the activity of those black holes can vary. And again, there's apparently a Goldilocks range of supermassive black hole activity that's necessary, we think, for galaxies to be able to support life. Galaxies also, in order to support life, have to have regions that are free from lethal amounts of energy and regions that are free from destructive gravitational tides. So life, for example, in the center of our galaxy would be difficult because in the center is that supermassive black hole, which is going to emit a large amount of energy and create unimaginable gravitational tides. And so, in addition, there are a lot of stars in this region, and some of them are quite large. And so it would be difficult for life to establish itself in the center of a galaxy. And if you go too far out, then the number of heavy elements would likely be very limiting. And without, again, heavy elements, you can't get life forms, at least not the kind of life forms that we are used to thinking about. So for a galaxy to support life, there has to be parts of it that are essentially ideal, right? That parts of it that don't have lethal amounts of energy or destructive gravitational tides, but which do have some reasonable concentration of heavy elements. Obviously, our Milky Way galaxy has all of these traits. And in fact, we exist in the sweet spot, if you will, or the galactic cradle of the Milky Way galaxy. So it's been said that within our galaxy, the so-called bio-friendly zone exists from about 23,000 light years out to 29,000 light years from the center of the galaxy. And it's no coincidence that our sun happens to be about 27,000 light years from the center. So we exist in this region that does not have potentially lethal amounts of energy all around, and we exist in a region where we don't have to worry about the immediate effects of the supermassive black hole, but there are reasonable amounts of heavy elements in this zone. Our star, which we refer to as the sun, is also an unusual structure. So within this region, we depend upon our star, and our star is not really big and it's not really small, right? It's in sort of a middle of the pack kind of star, and it has a reasonably long lifespan, long enough to power, for example, the last 4 billion years of evolutionary history. Our star has heavy elements within it. It's not a first generation star, which they were composed primarily of hydrogen and helium. Our star has heavy elements in it, and that matters because the planets that form around it can possibly also have heavy elements. Earth, for example, is a planet with a number of heavy elements. And so our star and the planets that circle it have sufficient heavy elements so that life could potentially come forward. Our sun also is lacking a companion. Many stars exist as duets, they interact. But when stars do this, when they interact, it can be difficult for life on planets that circle them to exist, because when they interact in this way, they make the movement of the planets difficult to, they make it difficult to become consistent. And so the environment on such places would tend to change dramatically. So our sun does not have a stellar companion, and that's very helpful. Our sun also emits relatively small amounts of destructive ultraviolet light, relatively small, at least compared to other stars similar in size. And so a lot of biological molecules will not hold up under intense ultraviolet light. And fortunately for us, our star doesn't generate a huge amount of that. Our star is big enough that it generates a reasonably large, potentially habitable zone, but the planets within this habitable zone don't necessarily have to be tidally locked. Around some stars, there are habitable zones, but the planets that exist within them would be tidally locked. And as a result, one side of that planet would always be hot and the other always cold. And for most life forms, that would not be a good situation. So our particular planet is not tidally locked, and that's very helpful. The sun has some solar activity, but it has less solar activity than many other stars that are similar in size. And solar flares are potentially destructive and can damage life. So it's very helpful that we happen to be around a star that doesn't have a tremendous amount of solar flare activity. Our sun also produces a constant and stable energy output. Its luminosity fluctuates just 0.1% over an 11-year cycle. Many other stars similar to our sun have a much higher level of fluctuation. In addition, our star rotates around the galaxy in a fairly circular orbit. And so it rotates around the central massive black hole that exists within the Milky Way. And to make one orbit, it takes 230 million years. But our sun, as I said, does so in a fairly circular fashion. It doesn't take plunges, for example, in towards the center of the galaxy. Some stars, as they rotate through the galaxy, do so in a much more erratic way. And that could make life on those planets difficult. In addition, as we rotate through the galaxy, as we orbit the galaxy, we tend to avoid spiral arms and stellar nebulae. And that's a good thing, because these places, spiral arms and stellar nebulae, tend to have a lot of stars, and they also have a lot of hydrogen and dust. And those materials, if we were to transit through them, could make life difficult on our planet. So we don't have a typical star. I mean, it's often said that Earth is rotating around just another typical star. Well, that's not true. I mean, the sun is not a typical star. It has many traits that make it different from most stars that we know of. But even if you live in a galaxy that can support life, and even if you live in the galactic cradle of that galaxy, and even if you are near a star that's suitable for life, it doesn't mean that in fact any satellite that circles that star could support life. You have to have a satellite, a planet or a moon or something, that is capable of supporting life. Earth obviously is such a place, but Earth is a very atypical satellite. Earth has many traits that make it unlike most planets that we're aware of. Typically, when people talk about the planets that could support life, they say, well, those planets are places where liquid water could exist. And yeah, that's true. I mean, planets that can support life likely have liquid water. But Earth has much more than that. It has much more than just liquid water. It also has a balance of heavy and light elements, and that's important for living systems. It has a moderate mass. If the Earth were huge, if it was supersized Earth, it would likely have a suffocating lethal atmosphere. If it were much smaller, it likely couldn't hang on to its atmosphere. So Earth has a moderate mass, and that's important. Earth also can generate a magnetosphere. And so this magnetosphere is produced when heavy elements move around the core of the planet. And they generate these magnetic fields, which are depicted by these blue and gold lines. And this magnetosphere is essentially a protected dome. It protects us from cosmic particles that would otherwise rip apart the atmosphere, rip apart water, and destroy living organisms. So it's hard to imagine a planet without a magnetosphere being able to support complicated living creatures like us. In addition, the Earth has plate tectonic activity. And this depends upon the heat gradients that exist within the planet. But because we have plate tectonic activity, it's possible to maintain a stable temperature. It's possible to recycle crustal material. And these plate tectonic movements can generate geographical and geologically complex areas. And again, many have made the argument that life probably can't exist on a planet that doesn't have plate tectonic activity. Furthermore, Earth has a relatively circular orbit around the sun. It's not perfectly circular, there's some elliptical character to it, but it's fairly close to being a circular orbit. And as a result, our climate is fairly stable. If the Earth had a more elliptical orbit, then there would be points where the temperature on the planet would be very high, and other points where it would be very low. It would be difficult, if not impossible, for complex life, at least the kind that we are aware of, to survive in an orbit, in a planet that takes an orbit of this kind. Earth also has a stable axial tilt. So the tilt of the planet doesn't fluctuate a great deal. Many planets do have axial tilts that fluctuate. And as if you live on such a place, again, the climate is unstable. It's extremely unstable. And so it's hard to imagine a planet or any kind of moon or other type of satellite supporting complicated life if it doesn't have a stable axial tilt. We owe our stable axial tilt to the existence of our large moon. Very few planets have a large moon. And so you might ask, well, how did our large moon come to be? And I discussed that briefly in the text, but that large moon is what stabilizes us and makes it possible for us, that plus, as I said, other features of our orbit, make it possible for us to have the environment that we need. And in addition, our planet has a favorable distribution of liquid water and dry land. Not every planet would necessarily have that, even if it were, quote, Earth-like. Our planet has an impressive geological and ecological diversity. And the climate is stable, but it's also mild. Right? So you could imagine a planet that has a stable hot climate or a stable cold one, but ours is a stably moderate climate, right? Which again is part of the reason liquid water can exist on Earth. So our planet has many important characteristics, and it's much more than just a place with liquid water. And so if you have all of these things, if you live in the appropriate type of galaxy, in the appropriate section of that galaxy around the star that may be able to support life, and on a planet that has some of the characteristics, or perhaps all of the characteristics of Earth, then the question is, would life come forward? And the answer is not necessarily. Right? Even if you had another Earth-like planet, it's not a guarantee that life would emerge on that planet. And so in the second part of the book, I focus a little bit about what has to happen for life to emerge from a lifeless world. And I begin this with a discussion of how, well, when do we think life arose on our planet? And well, our planet we think is 4.54 billion years old. And we think that life arose about 3.8 to 4.3 billion years ago. So it arose fairly quickly after the planet formed. But how did it do that? How did life come to be? Well, that's a question that we don't know the answer to, but there are many hypotheses. One that's been put forward is that life, in fact, didn't actually evolve on Earth at all. Some prominent scientists, including William Thomson, who's better known as Lord Kelvin, Francis Crick, and Fred Hoyle, have suggested that life evolved elsewhere and then essentially moved to Earth. was transported in some way to Earth. That's referred to as the panspermia hypothesis, but there isn't a lot of evidence to support it. And so if life didn't evolve somewhere else and then somehow get transported to Earth, the question becomes, well, how did life arise on our planet? And there are many hypotheses as to how that might have occurred. There are a number of books that have been written on this topic. And I don't try to go through all of the various versions of how life might have arisen. But what I do is focus on one particular hypothesis, the so-called Rna First Hypothesis. I do that because, well, maybe because I'm a molecular biologist, I like nucleic acids, but I also think there's a reasonable amount of evidence that support this Rna First Hypothesis. Essentially, those who put this hypothesis forward suggest that RNA may have served as an informational molecule, at least in early life forms. And in fact, in some entities, even today, like the COVID virus and the virus that causes AIDS, RNA can serve as an informational molecule. And RNA, they argue, also had catalytic activities. And they argue that on the early universe, it may have been possible to form structures like, for example, lipid bilayer. And as a result, RNA that existed within this bilayer structure may have been able to create an environment on the inside of this structure that was different from the environment on the outside. And eventually, these structures, they argue, may have given rise to the first so-called protocells. So in the book, I go through the various hypotheses that suggest that this might have happened. It's probably, I think, the most technical piece of what I've written. But in any case, I try to go through at least an outline of how that particular process may have unfolded. But if, in fact, the Rna First Hypothesis is correct, it suggests that life likely arose in a highly reducing atmosphere, very different from the one we're in now, in that it probably formed in a heavily UV irradiated, thermally graded, mineral-rich, hydrogen cyanide polluted, geologically unstable lake environment. That's a pretty specific environment. And again, it's not necessarily true that all Earth-like planets would have such places. Well, the first protocells, however they came to be, eventually gave rise to the first so-called true cells. And there are a number of steps to go from a protocell to a true cell. And the steps, the details of how that happened aren't known. But again, there are a lot of hypotheses as to how some of these transition events may have taken place. There are hypotheses as to how the first protocell could have eventually given rise to the first true cell. Eventually, though, true cells did appear on the planet, again, probably at least by 3.8 billion years ago. There were true cells, prokaryotes, specifically bacteria, like the one depicted, well, maybe not like exactly like the one depicted here, but a prokaryote bacterial cell that existed on the planet about 3.8 billion years ago, or perhaps even earlier. There may have even been different kinds of so-called true cells, cells that you could argue are, structures that you could argue are true cells, not just simply precursors of what we consider a cell. But if in fact there were different kinds of true cells that existed at some point, all of them have essentially perished and left no descendants. We know this because all living creatures can trace their ancestry back to what appears to be a single common ancestor. It's sometimes referred to as the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA for short. So in the book, I look at the evidence for the existence of LUCA. And I also look at what we think LUCA was. What do we know about LUCA? How did it survive? How did it live? And what we think is that LUCA was a thermophilic anaerobic autotroph that likely lives near deep sea vents. And it's probable that LUCA used metals, hydrogen-rich compounds, and carbon dioxide to create the carbon-based molecules it needed to survive. So this was our ancestor, this LUCA, but it was obviously a very different cell than the ones you and I are composed of. All right, well, once there were cells, even protocells that existed, once protocells and true cells existed, eventually they gave rise to a great diversity of life forms. That's obvious, we just need to look around. The question becomes, how did these first cells give rise to all the diversity that we see? And I look at that question in chapter 7, and I look at the processes that likely dictated which cells are going to survive and reproduce and which ones aren't. So I looked at the Darwinian mechanisms that operate over time, and I also asked whether these Darwinian mechanisms, if they were to be replayed, if we were to so-called rewind the tape of life, as Stephen Jay Gould once said, if we were to rewind the tape of life, would that organism, would LUCA eventually give rise to creatures like us again? And so I speculate on that. Obviously, nobody knows the answer. But I think to address the answer, it's necessary to first consider whether or not physical determinism actually exists. I argue in the text that it doesn't. A lot of philosophers will disagree, and quite vigorously so. But I think there's good reasons, biochemical reasons, for why ultimately physical determinism isn't a thing. It doesn't actually exist. But if physical determinism is, in fact, a reality, then I think if you were to rewind the tape, there could be no other outcome, right? If the world is a physically deterministic place and you were to rewind the tape of life, then there would be no other possibility but for life forms like us to come into existence. On the other hand, if physical determinism isn't a reality, then the question of whether we would come to be is not necessarily a simple and obvious one. And to address that question, assuming that physical determinism doesn't operate, I look a little bit at convergent and divergent evolution and how those processes would play out in a world that's free of physical determinism. I'll just tell you that I believe that if the tape of life were to be rewound, that there is certainly no guarantee that we would appear. There have been many organisms that are sometimes referred to as one-off creatures, whose existence was in no way a guarantee, and that our existence depended upon theirs. And so if you look at how life essentially evolved on our planet, it didn't necessarily have to give rise to creatures like us. At least that's the argument I make. So there are lots of creatures on the earth, lots of different kinds of creatures. Most of them are prokaryote. This is a depiction of the various relationships between living organisms. Again, presumably everything started from some common ancestor, but there are many different groups of prokaryotes. There are many different groups of archaea, and there are quite a few different groups of eukaryotic cells. But they're all connected, they're all interrelated. They all began from a single cell, we think, this so-called LUCA. How did bacteria, which were the first creatures on the planet, how did they, and archaea came shortly thereafter, how did bacteria and archaea eventually give rise to eukaryotes? Because that's what we think happened. We think that bacteria and archaea eventually gave rise to eukaryotes. How did that play out? Well, apparently that was a long process. It took about 1 billion to 1.5 billion years after the first prokaryotes exist for the first eukaryotes to come into existence. And again, it's a very protracted process that would have generated these first eukaryotic cells. And many argue there'd be no guarantee that that process, if it were to go operate, if we were to rewind the tape, that we'd even get eukaryotic cells, because there were many points in that process that weren't necessarily destined to happen if the world's not a physically deterministic place. So anyway, I look at some of the processes that ultimately gave rise, or at least some hypotheses, as to how eukaryotic cells may have come into existence. I also look at what determined the kinetics of these processes. Because if you think about it, if the evolutionary process had occurred more slowly, if it had, say, had occurred at half the speed that it actually did, well, we wouldn't be here either, right? We would not yet have evolved. And so what dictated the rate at which the evolutionary processes unfolded? That's some of the kinds of questions I tried to address here. And I asked the reader to ponder what would have happened if the kinetics that dictated the rate at which the evolutionary process takes place had been different. All right, so we ended up with eukaryotic cells, but how did these eukaryotic cells, once they appeared, how did they give rise to multicellular animals? Multicellularity is something that the first cells on the planet didn't exhibit. And multicellularity is a process that had to essentially take place for creatures like, it had to be possible, obviously, to form multicellular organisms for creatures like us to appear. So what made multicellular life possible? I look at some of the hypotheses that address that question in chapter 9. I also look in chapter 9 at some of the conditions that made it possible for life to, complicated, diverse animal life, to come into existence. And specifically, I look at some of the environmental conditions that held sway during the Cambrian era, where animal life exploded in its diversification. So that took place 541 to 516 million years ago. Once there were, though, multicellular creatures, animals, for example, they were in the sea initially. How did these multicellular creatures ultimately colonize land? It's an important question from our perspective because, well, we exist on land. But if you think about it, for intelligent life to exist, you don't necessarily need land. I mean, dolphins are intelligent. But if you're going to have technological societies and advanced cultures like the ones that we possess, I think it would be hard for that to occur on a planet that didn't have dry land. And so what caused the continents to form? And once the continents existed, how did living organisms eventually colonize land? We think that the first organisms to eventually colonize land were mat-forming prokaryotes that existed about 3.2 billion years ago. By about 1 billion years ago, it's believed that the first green algae and fungi moved on to land. But the first animals probably didn't appear on land until about 480 million years ago. And the first animals that appeared on land, we think, were relatively simple invertebrates, maybe similar to this worm that you see here called C. elegans. So these were probably creatures like this, were probably the first animals anyway, to move on to land. By about 375 million years ago, low-fin fish like Tiktaalik, which is depicted in this slide, probably ambled onto land in an attempt to avoid being eaten or in an attempt to find food. By about 365 million years ago, you could find the first amphibians. And by about 312 million years ago, the first reptiles. These creatures eventually gave rise to synaptid predators like Dimetrodon, which is displayed here. These were large creatures, and they dominated the terrestrial environment for quite a long period until ultimately they were eliminated during the Great Dying, also called the Permian extinction. And that took place about 252 million years ago. So I look a little bit about what happened then. It's a truly horrific time, and it did destroy most species that were alive then. But some obviously made it through, and that opened opportunities for other creatures like this crocodilian-like reptile to eventually take a place of dominance on the planet. So this type of creature dominated terrestrial environments for a long time, but it too was eliminated as a result of a great extinction. In fact, it was eliminated at the end Triassic mass extinction about 201 million years ago. With these animals gone, that opened up opportunities for the dinosaurs to take a place of prominence. Some of them made it through that impermanent extinction, and they eventually took over some of the niches that had been occupied previously by the other creatures I mentioned. And they ultimately became the dominant life forms on Earth for a very long time. For close to 135 million years, these creatures ruled the planet, at least the terrestrial aspects of it. But like the others before them, they met their demise as a result of a great extinction event. And in the case of the dinosaurs, it was an asteroid that impacted the Earth about 66 million years ago. This huge piece of rock hit off the coast of Mexico and eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs. It also eliminated most of the mammalian species that existed at this point. Mammals have been around for about 210 million years, but 66 million years ago, most of them were wiped out. And some have argued that as few as 15 to 20 species actually made it through this event. Obviously, our ancestors were one of those species, but it's thought that our ancestor at this time probably looked like this shrew that you see here. It was a small, unintrusive creature that spent its life scurrying around under the feet of the dinosaurs, but it did make it through that great extinction event. With the dinosaurs out of the way and with climate changing, the conditions eventually were ripe for the rise of some of the first primates. This particular animal is said to be one, we think perhaps, this is an artist's drawing of the animal, we think perhaps was one of the first primates to arise on the planet. And we think it appeared somewhere around 34 million years ago. But the question that perhaps is of interest to us, since we very much are always we're always interested in ourselves, right? I mean, the question that's interest to humans is, how do humans come to be? And how do these first primates ultimately give rise to the genus Homo? Well, we think that the first primates eventually gave rise to the Great Apes, and that somewhere around 5 to 8 million years ago, there was an organism whose descendants eventually produced the chimpanzees and bonobos, and another group which ultimately evolved into humans. We don't know a lot about this organism that the chimps and bonobos and humans all have in common as they're in their ancestral tree. But we are interested in knowing more about how this organism, essentially how its descendants evolved and eventually gave rise to humans. The answer to that is not necessarily definitively known, but it's thought that perhaps a creature like this one, Australopithecus afarensis, may have been in that line. It may have been a descendant of that common ancestor, and it may have been one of our recent descendants. Ancestors. And so in the book, I look a little bit about what some have suggested as to how a creature like this, if it wasn't afarensis, perhaps a creature like afarensis may have essentially been capable through evolutionary processes of producing descendants that which we now call humans. Humans, we think, first appeared about 2.4 million years ago, and by about 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus existed. Homo erectus, we think, arose in Africa, but within 200,000 years, it's believed that it had moved out as far as parts of Northeast Asia. So erectus did not necessarily stay in Africa. And we think that Homo erectus eventually gave rise to other species, which in turn gave rise to the Devonians, the Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens, namely us. Our kind arose in Africa. The Neanderthals and the Devonians were in Eurasia. And so the question that you might now ask is, well, what happened when you had all these humans living at the same point in time? The Devonians, the Neanderthals, and other sister species existed all at the same period, at least at one point. And we know that they're not around anymore, our sister species. So what did humans first look like, and when did they appear? Well, our type, not humans, but Homo sapiens, a specific type of human, we think first appeared about 315,000 years ago. This is a skull, a composite reconstruction of one of what we think were the earliest Homo sapiens. Again, this is around 315,000 years old. Some people argue that this skull is very different than a modern human skull, and you can see that. You don't have to be a specialist in this area to notice that it's not like our skull, and that it really wasn't a Homo sapien. Others say it was, so there's a debate as to whether it was or not, but it could be as long as 300,000 years ago that creatures like this came into existence, our type, Homo sapiens. These individuals lived in northern Africa, in what is now Morocco, and they made use of tools. So by then, they were using tools similar to this. And they and other humans that were outside of that area just specified lived in Africa. At some point, some Homo sapiens attempted to colonize Eurasia. They moved into the Near East and then essentially apparently met their demise. So initial attempts by Homo sapiens to colonize areas outside of Africa were not successful. But eventually, humans did succeed in moving out of Africa. We obviously know that, settling in the Near East and then spreading throughout Eurasia. 100,000 years ago, though, by far, most humans were located in Africa, as you can see in this diagram. But they started to successfully colonize areas outside of Africa, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100,000 years ago. When they did, they encountered other types of humans, other sister species that were there already, specifically, for example, the Neanderthals and the Devonians. And the question that you might ask is what happened when they encountered the sister species? This is a depiction of what a Neanderthal might have looked like. When modern Homo sapiens encountered Neanderthals, what happened? Well, we don't know. There's a lot of speculation. We do know that they did mate. We know that because we have Neanderthal DNA, and we also have DNA from other sister species like the Devonians. So in a very real way, these sister species still exist. Their DNA exists within us. But these creatures, these other humans, no longer are here. So what happened to them? Again, you can speculate as to what happened. Many people have suggested that what might have happened is that we Homo sapiens essentially catalyzed their demise. And once they started interacting with our kind, they didn't survive very long. We know that all the sister species went extinct within the last 50,000 years. And so although they had existed for quite a period of time, they did not continue to exist soon after they encountered us. We almost went into oblivion as well. We almost went extinct. There are a number of bottleneck events that almost eliminated Homo sapiens. For example, about 72,000 years ago, there was a supervolcanic explosion on one of the islands in the Indonesian archipelago. And it's believed that that explosion probably killed many Homo sapiens. And it's estimated the population at that time may have been somewhere between, I've heard everything from 2,000 to 30,000 to 80,000. But even at the upper limits, it was a small number of people. Others have argued that that supervolcanic explosion wasn't what was responsible for that bottleneck event. But whether it was or not, what's true is that there weren't a lot of humans on the planet at that point. We were not far from extinction ourselves. But obviously, we made it through that bottleneck event, as well as others. And by about 4,000 years ago, there were 72 million humans on Earth. 72 million is a relatively small number for us. When you think about it now, that's a small number. well, that number didn't grow all that big for quite a long period. That changed soon after the scientific revolution and the advent of the industrial era. And soon thereafter, human population skyrocketed. And there are now more than 7.8 billion of us on the planet. So I talk a little bit in the book about what may have precipitated these bottleneck events, what limited our ability to expand during this long period of time that where we were essentially an agricultural civilization, and what contributed to this great spike in our population growth. Well, in our current state, there's an awful lot of us. The question is, what's going to happen to all of us as we go into the future? Again, not a question that anyone knows the answer to with certainty. But what are we humans going to do in the future? We face some potential existential threats. One of them is that we could eliminate ourselves. We're the first species in history to be able to do that. We have the ability to eliminate ourselves. And there are lots of ways we could do so. I mentioned briefly some of them in the book, but the two most likely are nuclear war. We could destroy ourselves with our weapons, and we could destroy the environment which we're critically dependent upon. Beyond that, there's always the possibility that our kind could be eliminated as a result of Mother Nature. And nature has eliminated more than 99.9% of the species that have ever lived on Earth. And there are lots of possibilities, lots of ways that nature could eliminate our kind. In the book, I break them out into three categories. I don't want to go in, I don't go into great detail, and people have written many books on these sorts of things, but I break out some of the events into three categories. There are events that are not likely to happen, but if they did, would be catastrophic. There are events that are likely to happen, but we don't know exactly when. And there are events that will happen, but not until the distant future. And so the most, I think, pertinent of the existential threat that nature could bring upon us is a threat by a large object that collides with space, an asteroid or a comet, for example, something from space colliding with our planet. This was last time a really large object hit the planet. It ushered in the demise of the dinosaurs, right? 66 million years ago. We will be hit by asteroids in the future. Is there anything we can do to stop asteroids from eliminating us? NASA is trying to explore the answer to that question. There have been suggestions as to what we perhaps could do if our kind were to find out that an asteroid was on a collision course with the Earth. But in any case, at least we're thinking about it. The dinosaurs didn't have that option. We could also essentially meet our demise as a consequence of a supervolcanic eruption. There are quite a few supervolcanoes that exist on Earth. One is under Yellowstone Park. If these supervolcanoes explode, bad things happen to huge swaths of the globe. These things have been involved in eliminating creatures in the past. They have probably contributed to other mass extinction events. And in our society, which is heavily dependent upon technology, what would happen if something like this were to blow up? And can we do anything to stop it? Well, maybe. And some have proposed perhaps possible ways that we might be able to mitigate volcanic eruptions. But could we mitigate a supervolcanic eruption? Many people think not. But then again, many people thought you couldn't go to the moon at one point. So I actually am a fan of funding geology and volcanology, because our very survival might depend upon knowing more about these sorts of events and engineering and so on. Eventually, though, our sun will expand in size. It will eventually use up most of its hydrogen and stop using helium. It will take on the status of a red giant. And as it expands and increases its heat output, life on Earth will begin to end. This is thought to perhaps occur as soon as perhaps 500 million years from now. I'm not particularly worried about that. 500 million years, a long time, but eventually the the sun will expand and heat the earth to the point where life on earth likely will not be capable of sustaining itself. Eventually, it's believed that the sun may expand to the point where it engulfs the earth. And that may take place perhaps 8 billion years from now. Some have said 5 billion, but at some point in the distant future, the sun is potentially going to enlarge to the point where Earth itself is no longer. What will our descendants do if they exist? I mean, 500 million years from now is a long time. If there are any descendants of ours, what will they do? We don't know what they will do, and we don't have any idea what they would look like. If you think about it, 500 million years ago, our ancestors were sea sponges. And so 500 million years from now, if there are descendants of ours that exist, what will they look like? What will they be capable of? We obviously have no idea. But I end the book by reflecting on this long journey and thinking about some of the events that I described and questioning, again, is it likely that we're here? I think not, but I reflect a little bit about that on that. And then I also asked the question, does our existence and perhaps the existence of other intelligent creatures in the universe, does it suggest that the universe has a purpose? Many people say no. Some people say yes. And so, it's quite a debate. Does the universe have a purpose? Yes or no? I don't really get into that question. I just raise it because I think it's worth thinking about. But I've already gone longer than I should have. I got to stop. So I will thank you for taking the time to listen to this. So I apologize for going a little longer than I anticipated, but thank you for listening. If you do want to read more about some of what I described, you can buy the book at the Routledge webpage. And if you do so and you use the code here, ASM07, you get a 20% discount. So with that, I will stop. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Steven, thank you so much for an engaging and informative talk. I'm going to commend you also that on the fact that you did this journey essentially in 50 minutes, and it takes, I have a hard time doing it in 16 weeks during the semester. So thank you so much. We do have a few questions that are in the chat box. I'm going to go through a few with you in the order received. And then I can open up this space if people want to raise their, put that emoji sign for the hands up, and I can, you can state your question on Zoom as well. The first question that we got was from Hope, who says, what do you think of telling students that prokaryotes had the agency to create our oxygen atmosphere, which then made multicellular life possible? I so much want students to grasp the magnitude of agency as part of life.
Yeah, I mean, I address that in the book. I get into cyanobacteria, their creation, how those cyanobacteria that were able to produce oxygen were unlikely one-off creatures, but they were essential for our existence, right? So if it weren't for them, we wouldn't be here, right? Nobody really thinks much about cyanobacteria and how important they were to our existence. But I think that's a good point, right? And it's, I think, important to stress this, right? We are dependent upon creatures for our existence that like cyanobacteria. So I agree, but with the individual asking the question that the word, I mean, agency, I guess, the philosophers who I work with would, they get very enlightened or agitated when you use the word agency. But they were, if they, perhaps agency, whether they, I don't know. I mean, but they without them, we wouldn't have the oxygen-based atmosphere. And it's true, we wouldn't exist. I've used words like agency before and got myself in trouble. So, but yes, I think that they're critical for the existence of creatures like us.
Great. And then next we have Emmeline Coster, who asks, when your account first enters Earth's paleontological history with its unequivocal fossil evidence, I'm curious why you continue to couch your summary of developments in, quote, think and probable terms.
So I'm not, so one more time, the question is that
so when you first start to discuss Earth's paleontological history,
yeah,
with its unequivocal fossil evidence. This person's asking, Emily's asking, she's curious, or he's curious about why you continue to couch your summary of developments in think or probable terms.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I tend to do that because I guess, to be honest, it gives me some safety. And because in many cases, I mean, even evidence that we think is conclusive turns out not to be. And so, there is strong evidence for much of what I was saying. And perhaps I shouldn't use the word think, but in any case, frankly, it leaves me a little wiggle room, right? If in fact it turns out to be wrong, well, then we thought incorrectly.
Great. I think Emmeline has her hand up probably in regards to the question. So,
Sure.
Emmeline, go ahead.
Well, it's Emlyn as a male, by the way, and
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
That's all right. So I guess I'll reveal that my bias is as a geologist who has looked in detail at the fossil record, and I think when you sort of transition from astrological speculations, and I may not have that correct, into paleontological geological certainties, and the book is meant to enlighten the educated layperson, I feel respectfully that it's unfortunate that the terminology continues to be approximate. It's like talking about the theory of evolution when we know with much great certainty that it's not a theory, it's a fact. And what we're doing is pouring on more and more detail exponentially onto the course of fact. So I would like to encourage you to switch gears and sort of avoid using uncertain sort of descriptors when you move into certain territory. We are, after all, in the United States facing politicians who, the guy who's running for office in Florida says, so I understand that humans succeeded apes, so how come we still have apes?
You're very right. It's a good point. I'm not a geologist. I don't know as much about the topic as you, but people who do know and who are convinced that this is more than just a good hypothesis or even a theory have a point, right? I mean, perhaps it would be better to be more definitive and perhaps shut down crazy speculation of the kind that you just mentioned.
Stephen, I think also just to piggyback on Emily's point, one of the challenges and one of the aspects of teaching biology or any science is that I think we as educators need to make sure that we're embedding content with the nature of science. So in other words, speaking about terms of facts and theories, of course, theory in science is defined differently than it is in everyday common language. So I think we need to be more cognizant of that, and yeah, all of us need to do a better job in making sure that the nature of science aspect is also getting embedded throughout the science curriculum. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. But what do you think about that, Stephen?
No, I think you're right, and I think that, to be honest with you, I would have preferred to have written this with experts in different areas. I'm a biologist. I'm not a physicist or an astronomer or a geologist. So, I mean, it would be great to actually write a book like this in conjunction with others. Probably I should have tried to do that, because then you can be more certain, or at least I could have felt better about how convinced I was of the evidence. I don't know all of the evidence, but people like the last person who asked the question, Dr. Costner, I believe, yeah, they have a better grip on it. So it's a huge span of information. And many people, even us, those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about this, not necessarily experts in all the areas. And so it helps to have input like that which was just given.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. I believe it's from Lowell. Why do some life forms continue largely unchanged? In other words, there are still huge numbers of prokaryote cells, more or less like LUCA, and lots of other living fossils that have remained unchanged for millions of years, while others evolve. This is part of a question of why there is emergent complexity sometimes, but why stasis is the case perhaps more often.
It's an excellent question, and I bring out the point that there have been these so-called living fossils, and in a way, they've been more successful evolutionarily. They have a better track record than we do. we've only been on the planet for 300,000 years or so. Some of these other creatures, these so-called living fossils, have been around for a very long period of time. What makes it possible for them to be so successful, and while others have gone extinct? What gives them the edge? I mean, they obviously have the ability to survive and reproduce in the environment that they exist in, and they've been able to capitalize on that fact for a very long period. If that environment were to change dramatically, perhaps these living fossils would then meet their own demise. But they apparently have been able to continue to exist in an environment where they can survive and reproduce effectively. So I think the answer is that they have managed to find ways to survive and reproduce in the environment that they are in, and they've been good at it. Whether we can do the same, can we survive and continue to reproduce? Well, and that's not a certainty, right? And so perhaps at the end of the day, the dinosaurs, not the dinosaurs, the crocodiles and the alligators and those sorts of turtles and creatures like that will really be evolutionary more successful than we. But that remains to be seen, right?
All right, thank you. Ken Baskin asks, given the precision in so many conditions that made human life possible, do you believe there might be some design principle built into our universe that may have guided the path of evolution?
Well, that's a difficult question. Many scientists would argue no, right? That there is no design to the universe, and that the universe just is. There are a lot of books written by numerous authors. The Big Picture by, I forget the guy who wrote it, physicist. Anyway, many books that go on quite a bit on that idea that there is no reason for the universe to be. But I don't know that there's any evidence for that position. I mean, what is the evidence that suggests that the universe exists? Why does the universe exist, right? I mean, how did you get something from nothing? Some people say that the universe is infinitely old. Well, what does that mean, that the universe is infinite? How can you have something that never had a beginning? People can't answer questions like that. They can't tell you how energy came to be. They can't tell you how the conditions of the universe came to be. They can't tell you how the physical laws and the constants of the universe became established. They don't know. And so I don't know either. I don't know whether it just happened and there's no explanation for it, or if there's a deity that made it possible. I mean, if I knew the answer, I would be in an unusual position, but I just don't. I don't think it's possible to rule it out. We just don't have any evidence either way. Although some will argue that's wrong. We have evidence one way or the other. But in any case, I don't think we have any evidence as to how all these conditions came to be. We don't know why the laws of physics exist, or why the constants of the universe exist, or why energy came into existence. We have no idea. And so to say that somehow it must be that it just happened is not, I don't think, a scientifically based answer. Now, did God do it? Well, if there's a God, well, what created God, right? And how did God do these things? I don't know that either. So I just don't know.
Jay has a question which can be tacked on to the one that Ken just asked. Do we know the probability of random mutation to have evolved complex creatures like us over the vast amount of time that life has existed?
Yeah, I mean, the random mutations are important, but there are other processes acting through evolution that also influence that how things evolve. And in the chapter on evolution, I get into some of that. And in fact, there are a number of really good papers that have been published that talk about this as well. And I try to cite some of them in the book. So random mutation is important, but it's not the only factor that guides the evolutionary process. And if it were just strictly random mutation and selection of random mutation and nothing more, well, it's hard to know whether the evolutionary process, where it would be at this point. But it's not just, random mutation and nothing else that's acting here. There are other features of evolution that are important to consider which affect the kinetics of the process. And so I mentioned that in the talk that, well, what drives the rate at which features evolve? So it's worth considering some of those questions along with the random nature too. How does that contribute to the evolutionary process?
Thank you. Wendy Curtis has a question as well, and she's asking, the use of fire is thought by some to have occurred just before the emergence of Homo erectus. This would explain the build of Homo erectus, much slimmer, smaller teeth, etc. Although there is no evidence of fire from this early period in the fossil record, no early hearths, for example. Richard Wrangham, the author of How Cooking Made Us Human, makes the argument that it would have been a precursor. What do you think of this argument?
Yeah, I mentioned that, and I mentioned all of this in the text. I get into that question. When fire first came under human control, as you mentioned, is debated, right? Was it 2 million years ago? Was it 1 million years ago? Most people, at least the ones I'm familiar with, what I've read, suggest that we think that certainly by 1 million years ago, creatures like Homo erectus were able to harness fire. I don't know if it existed before that, because as the questioner said, we don't have a lot of evidence for exactly when fire first came under human control. But it's thought that certainly by 500 million years ago, we were able to use fire to cook food. And there's a lot of evidence that book and others have talked about the significance of that in the evolution of our kind. And so I touch upon it in the book. I mean, this is such a broad topic. It's hard to get into a lot of detail and many of these questions, but that's an important fact. And I try to get into it at least a little bit in the chapter that I write about the emergence of humans.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen, I wanted to ask you something which I've been, again, wrangling with for at least the past 3 to 4 years, and that is, how do we biology educators make this content more either aligned or embedded within the biology curriculum, so that it's part of the curriculum in such a way that we're not getting lost in all of the specific details or student learning outcomes, especially in the freshman level, at the freshman level, non-biology majors and biology majors courses. What advice would you have to folks like me, for example, who teach both of those courses, as far as embedding this cosmic story of life and making the content more relevant to students and how they think about science and biology?
It's a great question, and I try to address it in my own teaching. I teach a freshman course, a freshman biology course, and we as a department have agreed as to what we hope to cover in that course. But I try to wedge in a little bit on cosmic evolution and a little bit of the big history story. And I found that the students really like it. The vast majority of them find this to be the most interesting piece of the course. They find it fascinating. And it raises for them questions that they hadn't pondered before. It raises for them new connections that they didn't see before. And I think it's very much worth doing. The issue becomes, well, how do you do it? I think it would be great if I would like to actually teach a course on the biology of big history, because I think that you could do that, right? And I think that you would learn a lot of biology. You may learn you may learn a little information about other forms of science as well, but there's nothing wrong with that. And it brings also to the forefront the connections between the disciplines. Right? It's the biology is dependent upon the chemistry, which is dependent upon the physics, and so on. And so it shows the connections between disciplines. I think it's very much worth doing. But as you mentioned, we tend to enter specialized silos, and a lot of colleagues don't really see the value necessarily in doing this, and it's difficult. I don't know, it can be difficult to break through, right, and convince others that this is worth doing. So I don't know. I mean, I like to find a way. Maybe you and I can talk. You've been at it longer than I read and saw your seminar and have listened to what you've done, and I think that you have some great ideas. So I would like to try doing more of that in what I teach and find a way to do it. At a liberal arts college like the one I'm at, I think it's particularly appropriate to do this sort of thing. And I think you can make a strong argument for the value of it. But I don't know of a lot of places that do it.
Thank you. Emlyn has his hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks, Paul. So I'd like to just firstly echo what was just commented in the chat, which is you've made an amazing summary of the total scope of so much. But I want to, if I may, just surround a talk like this and a subject like this with the word existential, which I think you used just once, Steven, and that was to say that the term existential crisis is maybe used in the most severe sense when humanity looks at episodes like an asteroid hit or a super volcano that could, catastrophically diminish the species to nothing potentially. So I'd like to just sort of put this back in 21st century terms, where we have I think it was in 2019, that dictionary.com decided it was time to bring the word existential into the dictionary as the word of the year. And it signaled, as far as I understand, I've written a bit about this, that this was the first time in the history of the world, history of humans, Homo sapiens, that term existential crisis no longer meant someone who, on an individual, deeply personal scale, did not know how to cope with uncertainty in the future, but rather it was referring to the whole of society, that we don't know where the world is heading. And so I hope that maybe in other presentations around this subject matter, this is one of my concerns that some of my colleagues in the Big History Board, which I used to be on, know that I have, is that the word relevance means being consequentially pertinent to matters at hand, consequential matters at hand. And so to talk about this subject and not relate it to the challenges we face right here and now in linking nature and culture is, I think, on the verge of not really helping the public to really grasp what it should get from a subject like this. So I hope that there can be some greater urgency and currency and topicality sort of permeating these presentations in the future.
I think I agree with you. And part of, I think, the service of a big history course, particularly a biology-based big history of view, is to point out that there are a lot of creatures that have dominated the globe for a long time. Dinosaurs were on top of the pyramid, on the terrestrial pyramid, for 135 million years, but they went extinct. There's no reason why we can't also go extinct. And people that I know of don't think much about that. It's not something that people generally consider. I mean, you can, well, I'm going to probably reveal some of my politics here, but you can look at what's going on around the issue of climate, right? There's not a lot of concern by some groups about whether or not we will eliminate ourselves by destroying the environment. They just don't see that that's a thing. But perhaps if they saw that it's a thing and it happened and it has happened in the past and can very well happen again, it might maybe change some views. So I agree. I think it's an important issue that we should try to address.
Thank you, Steve. I want to get to Ken Baskin, who has his hand up.
Thank you, Paul. I want to comment on what Emlyn just said, because there actually have been periods where societies faced existential crises. The main ones happened during the Axial Age, when cultures were moving from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and political dominance was moving from individual states to empires. And in Israel, Greece, India, and China, there were these tremendous social upheavals. For 200 years in China, there were 7 separate states fighting to control the empire. Several of them had armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They nearly tore the society to pieces. And one of the things that has struck me and that I'm working on now is that no one ever asks, how did they survive? And the answer, which shocked the hell out of me, is each of them ended up tweaking their mythology. And it's a long conversation. I'll talk about it with anyone who's interested. But I think the issue of the of our facing an existential challenge. And the fact that it has happened before is something that we in big history really ought to take a close look at.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are really good points, and perhaps really good arguments. Getting back to Paul's point earlier, for why an educated population should be exposed to this information, the information of big history.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken and Steve. Stephen, there's a question here by Wendy Curtis. Do you think that it would be worth stressing that the universe is a matched set and ecosystems are also a matched set? Yes, they are special and maybe improbable, but the fact that they are a set is also an interesting talking point.
Yeah, the fact that one goes with the other. Yeah, I mean, the way in which they are connected, right? It is a fascinating talking point. The universe created the conditions under which creatures like us could be here, and all the precursors of us. And so, yeah, it's a match set. I don't know if I'm answering Wendy's question.
I can maybe expand on Wendy's question or comment, because she had put something in the chat earlier on also. So let me just read that. If the universe had been different with different universal constants and maybe other forces instead of what we call the four forces, it would still have been a matched set unto itself. It might have had an inventory of particles that would, of course, interact as a set. If there were life in such a universe, maybe life there would use as its building blocks particles that were in the middle, not too big and not too small. In our universe, that particle is carbon, which has room for more electrons in its outer shell, but has enough to be relatively stable. Maybe we should think of our universe as a particularly favorable matched set.
Yeah, so is it so, Wendy? Are you suggesting that we consider like the multiverse hypothesis, the fact that there may be many universes, and that ours just happens to be one that it has the conditions that allows us to come into existence? Or I'm not sure if that's what you're suggesting, but I mean, I think that so some have suggested that. I mean, that's a pretty popular idea among many physicists, that perhaps there is a multiverse, and that this universe is just one of many, and that this universe is essentially what you said, a matched set, right? We have all the conditions that will make it possible for us to come into existence. Now, what would it be like in a universe where the conditions were different? Well, in some cases, if the conditions were even slightly different, you wouldn't get, for example, clumping of hydrogen. For example, if all the molecules in the initial universe had been equally spaced, then presumably there would be no clumping of hydrogen. There would be no essential formation of any structure. It would just be hydrogen molecules all equally distant from each other for presumably eternity. That's a rather small change, right? The asymmetry of particle distribution in the early universe was pretty minimal, but it was enough to give rise to the structure that we have. Now, if it had been zero asymmetry, many physicists argue there would just simply be nothing other than hydrogen for all time. And so in some cases, I think you can tweak the universe in ways that would result in no life, no possibility of life. And many physicists argue that there are an infinite number, or 10 to the 500 number of universes, according to Stephen Hawking, and that in most of these, if not all of them, or the vast majority of them, there is no life. But in some of them, Oz, for example, the conditions just happen to be so that life could emerge. So I think it depends on what kind of tweak we're talking about, right? Are we going to, there's some tweaks that you could do that perhaps would allow this situation to unfold as you suggest, but there are other changes that perhaps would be such that you just couldn't have any life at all in such a place.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen, I wanted to ask you, so what's next for you? What are you going to have another part 2 coming up?
Well, I think Wendy wanted to ask something.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Wendy.
Yeah, I guess my question is sort of twofold, or my reasons are twofold. One is, this is a really important concept, this Goldilocks concept, that we have these really specific specific circumstances that, bring us to where we are today. And it's, of course, a really important concept, and it's still new enough that there's certainly a lot of people who haven't heard it. On the other hand, it also, at least in these circles, and in gets a lot of airtime. And I kind of wonder if it might kind of widen our toolkit to also talk about another aspect of that, of the Goldilocks, because I guess I hear it quite a bit, but of course I'm always reading this stuff, so maybe that's the only reason. But I'm always thinking about how to make all these things we talk about reach a bigger audience. So that's one aspect of it, and then the other aspect of it is it ties into, it helps stress the idea of emergence, that life emerges out of the set of circumstances in our universe, and that life is because it selects, because there's these selection mechanisms, that there's evolution, and it's also sort of builds in the sort of some systems theory and the idea of an ecosystem where everything's interacting with everything else, that the waste product from some life forms are the raw materials for another, and I guess maybe I'm a little obsessed with this idea of the matched set, yeah, I guess, like, I do think it's worth sometimes mentioning in a big history text, the idea of the multiverse, but then I feel like just giving that a few paragraphs is probably enough, because otherwise everything becomes almost so seemingly random, or there's so many possibilities one can't really get a grip. But I really like this idea about how life is this system, and the universe is this system. And I first learned the idea of this match set in an art class, where everyone was given a block of wood, and you had to make 2 cuts and then rearrange all the pieces, and you had to use all the pieces, and you couldn't add anything. And it was interesting how everybody's sculpture had its own intrinsic logic, and they were also different, although we all started out of the same block. So I think about this a lot, and that obviously the environment is a complete system, and that all the pieces, you can't get rid of any pieces, and they all like interact. Anyway, so maybe it's just a little food for thought. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, no, well, thank you. I think students are fascinated by that. The fact that this is what you just talked about is, I think, what they find very exciting, like that these situations exist. And so I would like to, it would be nice if more people knew of all this information. And I guess the question that Paul has addressed, and that I think is interesting, is how do we do that? And how do we make this appealing, and to a bigger audience than what it currently seems to appeal to?
Thank you, Stephen. I'm gonna go ahead to Kathy Russell. Hi, Kathy. And I'm just gonna preface before I get to Kathy. My computer is showing that it's going to restart in about 12 minutes. So that means I'm gonna shut down, whether I like it or not. It's the universe telling me something. I don't know. But maybe we can make Kathy's question the last one for now, because I know that we're almost approaching the 2-hour mark. So Kathy, why don't you go ahead, and I'll have some final thoughts and gratitude for Stephen and everybody. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so Stephen, thank you so much. This is a great presentation. I too am a biologist, and so it's nice to have a book out there with this perspective. And I was curious, you'd mentioned the idea of purpose, and that triggered in me a new book that has just come out by Bobby Azarian, and I wonder if you've read it. It's called The Romance of Reason. And he's looking at big history ideas. And one of his really thought-provoking ideas is that when you had the evolution of life, the emergence of life also meant the emergence of purpose in the universe. And his idea is that all living creatures alive today, maybe not the protocells, but certainly every cell today, is purpose-driven. So a bacterium, and that was selected for, so a bacterium, very simple bacterium, will swim towards food and away from toxic chemicals, for example. And all plants, you know, bend toward the light. There's, and then certainly by the time you get to animals, we're all purpose-driven. We want to get to food, we want to reproduce, we want to chocolate, we want beer, we want, you know, all the things that we want. And that purposefulness is a powerful, powerful driver of evolution, such that by the time you have humans that can really leverage our purpose-driven natures, and combined with the information we're getting about the universe, the speed of evolution is just going like crazy. So anyway, my question was, what do you think of this idea of purpose being an evolved trait of life?
Well, I think it certainly is. Purpose, it certainly is an evolved trait, right? I mean, you're right. I mean, we exist with purposes, and we may select environments that make us more likely to evolve in a certain way because of that. And so, yeah, I certainly think that purpose exists. I guess there's purpose that exists because we exist. And then there's another question that you could ask, is there a purpose before before life? Was there a purpose to the universe? That would now get into the issue of a deity, right? Was there a deity that set the universe up? So there's different levels of purpose, you know, that you could explore, but I certainly think you're correct that there is purpose. At a minimum, there's a purpose in the universe because we impart that purpose to the universe.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Steven, are there any future plans for another big history style biology-based book or article, or what are you currently working on?
To be honest, I'm just trying to recover from this. You know, it was a big endeavor for me because it required me to stretch beyond my own little silo of information, and I'm thinking about, you know, what else I could do. I would like to work more closely with other people who know more than I in different areas of this discipline, and perhaps this will maybe give me an opportunity to do that. I do think the question of purpose is a fascinating one, and the question of what big history suggests about that, I think is worth considering. You know, I've read a lot of books by scientists, as I mentioned earlier, who argue that it has to be that there is no God. I'm not saying that there is a God or there isn't, but I read a lot of books by physicists. I'll tell you, I'm an agnostic. I just don't know, right? But there are a lot of books written by physicists and others who argue for atheism as though it were a scientific fact. I don't agree with that. I mean, it's not a scientific fact. But in any case, I think the topics like that are interesting, and I'd like to explore more. But I haven't really fleshed out any clear path to such an approach.
Well, along those lines, I want to encourage everybody to go ahead and purchase the book. And there is a 20% discount. The code is on the screen. Steven has shared that, ASM 07. So it's definitely on my bookshelf, and I'm going to use it actually in my class that begins this coming Monday. So it's very timely, Steven. Thank you. Thank you for all your hard work and for, again, a brilliant, engaging, informative talk and conversation. On behalf of the International Big History Association, I want to thank everyone for attending. Lowell, are there any final words or comments you'd like to make? Perhaps not.
Yeah, let me just say the same thing. First of all, thank you to Paul for moderating this, and many thanks to Steven. This is big history at its best. I'm not a biologist, and I found this presentation so exciting and brilliant, and I really thank you for contributing in this way.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
All right. On that note, I bid you all farewell. Till we meet again, my friends. Take care. Steven, thanks.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Take care.